Check out my Context for Kids Bible curriculum books. I have volumes on honor and shame, biblical covenants, ancient social relations, image-bearing, idolatry, and the new creation starting at ages 7 and up, all the way to books for late teens and adults. Each book contains 50 lessons on major Bible context topics. At Context for Kids, I take grown-up scholarly material and I slow it down. I never dumb it down. Available at Amazon.com. Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome back to Context for Kids. This week we're going to talk about who were the Pharisees and Scribes. It's so important to know this, and especially in Matthew 23, but really throughout all the Gospels, because we see Yeshua, or you guys might call him Jesus, we see him constantly getting into arguments with these guys, and we got to figure out why and what was going on, or we're just left scratching our heads wondering, well, what the heck is going on? Now, there was a historian in the 1st century named Josephus. Well, 1st and 2nd century, because he kind of overlapped. He was born just within a decade after Yeshua died and resurrected. So he was a priest, and so he knew an awful lot about 1st century Judaism and the context of the Gospels, and we get a lot of really good stuff from him. Anyway, Josephus wrote that there were 4 main philosophies within Judaism, among Jews, in the 1st century. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Now, what's a philosophy? Is it just a college major? Well, a philosophy in ancient times was a group's opinion on how to shun evil and pursue virtue. This idea came from the Greeks, and after the Greek occupation of the Holy Land, factions started springing up in Jewish society, as different people sometimes had very different ideas about how to live for God and obey His commandments. Sounds like today, right? Now, the Essenes decided that Jewish culture was totally corrupt, and they went out into the wilderness to live in exclusive societies, or we might call them communes, which were devoted to ritual purity and brotherly love. But they only had brotherly love for people who thought the way they did, and they pretty much didn't even think other Jews were actually any better than pagan Gentiles. Now, the Sadducees were a small group within the upper class. Remember, in Jewish society in the 1st century, there was a lower class and there was an upper class. There was no middle class. Didn't exist. It was nothing like we know today. You either had money and a lot of extra of everything, or you were scraping by and you could hardly even survive during the Roman occupation. But the Sadducees were a small group within the upper class. Josephus said that they were only friends with the rich. I said Sadducees, right? Yeah. Josephus said they were only friends with the rich, and that they fought with everyone, including one another. They didn't believe in the resurrection, and so they didn't think there would be any final judgment. I want to ask you right now, if you didn't think there was going to be any final judgment, how would you live your life? Oh, it could be pretty bad. Now, the Zealots really didn't exist yet as a group in the time of Yeshua, but they were very important right before the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. Now, but we didn't come here to talk about any of those 3 guys. We just came here to talk about the Pharisees. Now, I really didn't tell you much about the other ones because they're not the point this week. I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of who was out there. Now, the Pharisees, like the Essenes and Sadducees and Zealots, were known to us, would be known to us now as a faction. Okay? Now, a faction is a group within a group. People who belong to factions have an idea about how the rest of the group should believe and live. Factions aren't usually the majority, and so they often will fight to recruit people to believe and do things their way so they can become more powerful. In the United States, we've got the Republicans and the Democrats are the 2 most powerful factions. is politically, right? And in the UK, you've got Labourers and you got the Tories, and I don't really know enough about British politics. I'm sorry, but that's the kind of thing. Now, the Pharisees were very concerned with three things: tithing, ritual purity, and Sabbath keeping, according to Josephus. And according to the Gospels, we see them really nitpicking with Yeshua about these things. Now, it was also important for them to get along with the Roman occupiers as much as humanly possible without actually breaking commandments. Now, Josephus, though, even though he was one of them, by his claims, he said that they were power hungry. And that during the times before the first century, before he was a Pharisee, they got into a lot of trouble meddling in politics. Now, we know they were well educated because they were able to study the scriptures. They were also well liked by the people, who tended to do things their way. They were part of the retainer class of the wealthy. So they had money and the ability to study. Retainers are like, they would be working for the upper class. They wouldn't be like the nobility and stuff, but they would be professionals who were getting paid a lot of money and so had more leisure time than most, and they weren't out breaking their backs trying to work the land. And they weren't artisans like Yeshua was a carpenter. They weren't doing any of that stuff. We see carpenters these days and they make some serious money, and plumbers don't even get me going. But in those days, no, those would be low class people. Now, the Pharisees would often get into fights with Yeshua, trying to keep people from following and honoring him. But, you know, many Pharisees came to believe in him later. And some even believed in him secretly, and we see that in the Gospels. Now, Josephus was a priest who was also a Pharisee. He said that there were only about 5,000 to 6,000 Pharisees. That's it. Not very many when you think of the millions of people living in the Holy Land in the first century. Now, there were two main factions of Pharisees who disagreed with each other a lot: the houses of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and we will talk about them more some other time. This is a quick teaching. Now, the Pharisees were a faction of Judaism wanting to reform Jewish life to their own standards, but who were the Scribes? The Scribes were a professional class. So whereas the Pharisees were a group of people bound together by ideas and philosophies, the Scribes was a job. Scribes were a job. So now some Scribes were Pharisees, some were Sadducees, some were Herodians, some were Essenes, and some were probably none of the above. They were well educated, making legal documents, working as secretaries to powerful men. They were translators and lawyers and copiers of documents like the scrolls of the Hebrew Scriptures. And sometimes they were even teachers. When we hear about the Sadducees and Scribes lumped together, like in Matthew 23, these Scribes will be Pharisees. Now, some translations will call them Torah teachers, but I think scribe is best because not all scribes were Torah teachers any more than all books are written by or written about the Bible. Now, if you want more information, why don't you check out my teaching, episode 13, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Scribes, oh my, on my YouTube channel, Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, or download it on my Podbean channel, characterandcontext.podbean.com. And as always, I love you, I'm praying for you, and I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful week studying Scripture together as a family. Take care.